Thanks for having me, Adam. So the Ballarat Gov Hub is a project that's been designed by John Wall Architects. It's a very interesting project because it started off its life as a concrete structure, and it morphed into a timber structure some way part through the design process before tender. It was really interesting to tender the project because we were being asked to price the concrete conforming project. And at the same time, they were asking us, hey, can you put in a price for timber? And if the timber price looks good, we'll definitely consider it. And the client is Development Victoria and Regional Development Victoria. So just through that process, I guess a number of design principles were employed to really understand at tender what was required to make it a successful timber project. And I guess, a number of considerations came into play. And some of those were understanding the current design and its use, what was it being used for, and how the current grid design worked. So the option for the grid design at the time was under the concrete was a 9x12, and then this timber design ended up being a 9x9, 9x6 grid. So that worked quite well with sort of standard timber sizes. And then again, understanding that fit for purpose requirement, being a office building, not a laboratory or something like that. So the risk for fire was quite low, and the benefits of the biophilic design was quite high, being an office environment. The buildability around the timber for us was considered at tender. So understanding that we had to have a really well-developed design, really coordinated design, and our understanding of a mass timber installation at the time probably wasn't as advanced as it is now. But we understood it wasn't complicated. We understood it's quite simple, and we teamed up with some good partners to work through that during tender. And then part of that process was really understanding the interface trades, such as facade, which was really super important, of course, to understand the build-up of facade and how that would play on the timber design, because a lot of those elements weren't considered in the tender because the timber design was only really early in its days of design. And then obviously things like, standard service design and reticulation and how that played in terms of, your beams and your location of a reticulation of services throughout the building, being such a long floor plate, how that would work. And of course, testing and compliance, particularly with fire, which our knowledge on that is far more advanced now, thankfully. So there was a lot at play there. And then I guess all of that was evaluated by the team, and we arrived at the conclusion that the cost was fairly neutral compared to a concrete design, which was really great because the client, Development Victoria, Regional Development Victoria, they endorsed that process, endorsed that change to timber, and then we engaged with timber suppliers and the engineers to finalise that design and the connection details to get to where we are today. So, yeah.
Fantastic. It's been seems like a great journey all the way through. And I'd like to just ask a question on the cost. So, you said it's roughly the same, give or take, but it's obviously a bit more nuanced in where is timber more expensive and where is the cost savings compared to concrete, and where is concrete, say, more expensive compared to timber? So a bit more of the nuance between the two.
Sure. So the cost differences are where you might need to fire rate the timber extensively. For instance, where you've got a whole series of penetrations. For us, it was better to use a concrete core to consolidate those penetrations and have the bathrooms all in the core. So it's more expensive to use timber in that instance, especially you're waterproofing it, you're not going to see it. You're not exposing it from underneath. So the benefits are not quite there. And also timber is very expensive where you have, under certain structural requirements, such as the massive cantilever that we do have at Ballarat Gov Hub. As I said, the design initially was around concrete, so the cantilever worked fine then. But the cantilever as it stands under timber, the timber member sizes were going to be absolutely huge. We're not going to be seeing that. We're going to be encased in a wall, and the benefits really didn't work in terms of using timber there. So we ended up with a bit of a hybrid option just for those areas, being steel and concrete, but generally throughout it was timber.
Yeah, fantastic. And you did mention a little bit about why the client preferred timber. So biophilia and sustainability. Do you think these are strong drivers? Is this unique to, say, public projects, but also private, do you think, as well?
Look, to be honest, the developers we're talking to, they care about money, let's be honest.
Yeah.
Government projects, public sector works, they are all about carbon capture, which mass timber does awesome at. They all are all about that zero carbon footprint, and also, the biophilics. Where private developers get over the line on this one is the fact that you're really providing a really highly marketable building, especially if the use is something like of public nature, not like a lab or a factory or something like that, where they know the biophilics are really going to be marketable. They're really going to be something that people are looking forward to work in. And also the conditions of timber. So just it's fairly low maintenance. You get to see it if it's getting dirty, you can touch it up or whatever. It's those type of things that are really marketable for a private developer. But in this instance, as you said, Development Victoria really did focus in on the fact that the cost worked, which was awesome.
Yeah.
That the biophilics was paramount, and the carbon capture was there. So they are certainly, government is certainly trying to focus in on ESD and trying to bring mass timber into that equation.
Absolutely, Jack. Yeah, we've anecdotally heard about, for private development, say in office buildings, maybe about 5% increased, say, rental yield on a building like an office building. And then even if it does cost a little bit more upfront, which it can in some cases, then there will be a payback period for that slight variation. And then over the long term, you got an asset that a lot of companies out there, particularly tech companies who want to show their values, they might be happy to pay a bit more of their premium for a quality product.
Absolutely.
You did allude, Jack, before to the certification, and there was some learnings and challenges and hurdles you overcome along the way. Can you just talk us through how that whole process went, and say with the testing and so forth?
Well, there's kind of two parts to it. Of course, there's the structural certification, which I think is just as important as the fire side. And obviously the two are intertwined, especially with timber. But the structural certification was an interesting journey because ACOM led the design with Exclam Dolomiti, of course, being the supplier and quasi designer as well. And then having our independent certifier on the journey at every design meeting, rather than receiving a bunch of documents at the end. Really understanding the journey and understanding the design and why certain things were done the way they were. So it was really beneficial to go through that process with the independent certifier. And then And then in terms of fire certification or compliance, the journey, of course, started with the fire engineering, and that was there was a few lessons learned through that process, but that was an interesting journey because we had to engage obviously with the building surveyor, and the building surveyor said to us, okay, well, we understand this is a mass timber project, fire risks are fairly low, the building can be, you can fight the fire from 3 sides of the building, from the street. It's an office building. The risks were very low. And but there wasn't enough comfort around the mass timber fire engineering strategy, especially things around that considered, char ratings, delamination, tests that were around loading, modified hydrocarbon curves, all those kind of things, without getting too technical. So the building surveyor basically said, look, to provide a bit more comfort, not only to themselves, but to FRV, CFA at the time, and also to, mitigate that risk of Building Appeals Board review, which we weren't opposed to, but would have extended the project's timeline, which we didn't want to do. It was beneficial for us to engage a third-party peer reviewer for the fire engineering. So that was the process. We engaged that third-party fire engineer review, and that certainly helped the project and flushed out some of the finer details around concerns around delamination and accelerated hydrocarbon curves, like accelerated fires, especially with mass timber, and the understanding that mass timber adds fuel to the overall FRL of the building. So there was a lot of things considered through that process, and it was a bit of a journey to get to the end, but it was well worth it.
So it sounds like bringing the certifier through and having them engage a lot more and mitigating that risk of, as you said, the going to the BAB or having anything pushed back or stalling. Is this one of the priorities that you have now for future projects? Absolutely.
Any sort of mass timber projects, it's my strong recommendation to engage a third-party fire engineer review, not just a third-party structural review, and take them on the journey with you through the design process, because having that independent peer review is really beneficial, because they will see things from a different perspective. They may ask all the questions that perhaps the building surveyor is going to ask, or somebody on the Building Appeals Board is going to ask. So it's certainly beneficial. And I think FRV do favour that independence as well.
Yeah. I just noticed I've probably used a couple of acronyms there so as you said, BAB, for those listening in other states, is the Building Appeals Board, which is, I think, Victorian only. And you said so Fire Rescue Brigade. Yeah.
Fire Rescue Victoria, FRV, which is the amalgamation of our country fire authority, and the Melbourne Fire Brigade.
Gotcha. So everyone listening, they know the equivalent, I guess, state by state, with each state being quite different, for how that's set up, which makes it interesting also. So you had fire tests for this project. Do you think going forward, as more and more fire tests happen, eventually it might taper off with the amount of fire testing that might be required for projects? Do you think that's a real possibility as you go forward onto other projects?
I do think it's a possibility. It's whether or not that data is shared between builders or not. If, for instance, if we, Kane Nicholson's, if we kept our data and didn't share it, then it would be less of a risk for us and we'd have more information, so it would taper off. But the other aspect of that is as you know, the way that CLT works, for instance, and the different properties of timber, if you're adding layers, taking layers out, using different types of glues, that sort of thing, there are many different parameters to be considered when you are doing fire testing. Okay, so you couldn't just do one standard CLT test and then extrapolate data from that. So yes, I can see it tapering off, but a lot more testing still needs to occur.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so good. So doing the project now, what are some of the important learnings that you had along the way in terms of building and design and the whole lot?
I think being clear on the testing certification process from the very beginning is very important. You know, engaging with the building surveyor, understanding the expectations that are required to get your building permit, you know, to get your certificate of occupancy. What are the requirements from the building surveyor from the regulatory point of view? Super important, because at that point, depending on, you know, I guess the risk assessment of the building, you might be engaging a peer reviewer, fire engineer peer reviewer. You might be just saying, hey, this is a completely deemed to satisfy building. You know, we don't need to engage. It's very low risk. It's a single story building. You know, it really super important to understand the expectations at the beginning. I think some of the other learnings really are around the misconception in the construction industry that timber is a fire hazard compared to concrete and steel. I think that the perceived risk is higher. So, you know, further justification with the peer reviewers is probably required. And if you want to demonstrate compliance with testing and reports a lot sooner than possible, you know, so you want to be engaging in those tests and getting all of that done as early as possible so you can deliver your project. What we kind of learned through this process was, because the timber design was so early in its conception, that, you know, we didn't have that data that we needed in order to hit the ground running when we needed to. So we were very fortunate that you know, we had some really good collaboration with, you know, engineers and all sorts of people all around the world to really help us out and make sure that we deliver the project on time. But if we didn't have that support, we definitely would have struggled. You know, well, it definitely was a team effort. So I mean, there's some of the learnings. You know, as I keep saying, you know, design for timber, design for mass timber, and design for it early. You know, don't switch between the two, between concrete and timber. If you're going to use a hybrid and stick with it. It's important to understand that, because your service design is going to be different, right? Your reticulation is going to be different. Understanding things like the cantilevers we spoke about earlier, you know, your limitations on timber design. Sure, you can go down certain routes, but the cost benefit might not be there. Understanding what you actually want to see at the end of the day. You know, one of the important things that we learned was engaging with the client to demonstrate to them what they're actually going to see in the final built outcome. That was fairly critical in our process.
Yeah. There's so much in that. And you mentioned how hybrid, so say you cantilever, you're going to have a full timber system for certain grids, and then you're switching the system. So I guess the difference has been that's hybrid, two systems and the same for different grids, as opposed to a hybrid where you got steel beams and steel columns, say with a CLT floor all the way. So yeah, so was that a bit of a challenge with that cantilever and connecting with the rest of the timber building, was it?
It was a bit of a challenge. I think the greater challenge was understanding the impact of the steel on the timber. So this sort of falls itself into accelerated charring, where the steel heats up and then might affect the timber where it's connecting. So, you know, there was some challenges around that, around encapsulating the steel, around reducing its thermal impact on the timber, and then maintaining its integrity under fire. So, you know, there was certainly some challenges there. A lot of modelling was done, and we really had to demonstrate to the nth degree that, you know, this was a safe building to occupy well before we started fabricating, which was certainly challenging in terms of program.
Fantastic. Well, it's been very interesting hearing about the Ballarat Gov Hub. Going forward, what do you see as the whole industry in terms of progression? What do you think the future of timber construction is?
Yeah, great question. Look, I'd like to start by saying I think WoodSolutions have done a great job in terms of educating the construction community. I think, you know, it's been really great, but a lot more needs to be done with authorities in terms of compliance, regulatory compliance, especially with bodies like the VBA and bodies like FRV, you know, taking them through what mass timber means in terms of firefighting, that sort of stuff, and really having a better regulatory process to really provide a lot more mass timber buildings in the future, easier anyway. I think that, you know, more fire testing and standardization needs to occur for all of that to support that process. And, you know, I'd like to see more opportunity for other builders as well. To be honest, I think the market's a little bit not monopolized.
Yeah.
There are some handful of builders that can do really big mass timber projects. And, you know, I'd like to see IP being shared and IP being developed, you know, collectively. You know, in terms of what I'm seeing at the moment, in terms of pipeline, you know, we're seeing more commercial timber projects come on board. So I do think that, you know, those misconceptions I spoke about earlier, I think they are changing. I think developers and clients are seeing the benefits of mass timber, you know, not just for their workforce in terms of biophilics, as I said, but also as a marketable asset. So I hope to work on more mass timber projects in the future. You know, hopefully we can get there as a team, but, you know, I hope it does. I hope it does come to pass, and I hope those misconceptions go away, because it's one of the best things to happen to the construction industry, and I honestly believe that.
Yep, and I absolutely agree with you there, Jack. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast. If people want to find out more about yourself or Kane Constructions, or if there's anything you'd like to plug for the listeners, where should they be going?
Well, go to the Kane Constructions website. All of our projects are on there, and a little bit about me there. And I think, Adam, you've probably got a few presentations from myself from past that you could pop on the link there. Yeah,
I'll put in the show notes. So for those listening, Jack did a great webinar last year with your colleague of yours,
Peter Spence.
Peter Spence, that's right. So yeah, recommend that, and I'll put the link in the show notes. So thank you very much, Jack.
Thank you, Adam.